So, welcome everyone, and thank you. Thank you for listening. So, I want to begin with the sentence that brings people into this work almost more than any other. Nothing bad happened. Nothing bad happened. Really. My parents loved me. I had food, a roof, no abuse, no addiction in the house, no grief, no deaths to speak of. And yet, somewhere inside, there is a kind of emptiness that I can't account for. A sadness with no story. A sense that something is missing, and I can't tell you what. And if that sentence, in any of its versions, is yours, then this might be for you. You are not making it up. You are not being ungrateful. You are noticing, with reasonable accuracy, that something was missing. And the fact that you can't point at it is not evidence that it wasn't there. It's evidence of exactly the kind of missing it was. What I'd like to do over the next few minutes or so is name what often goes by the name nothing, to give you language for what was absent. When you were small, that you have been quietly carrying ever since. And to do this without making your parents villains, without manufacturing grievance, or without asking you to upgrade your story into something that it isn't. Because this is, I think, one of the most underserved forms of suffering in the modern psychological conversation. Not because nobody has named it. Researchers and clinicians have done good work on it, but because the people who actually have it in their day-to-day lives often refuse to claim it. They think they don't qualify. So let me describe what this often looks like from the inside. So you are by most measures doing well. You have a job, you have relationships, you have function. Friends would describe you as together. You don't have the kind of childhood that would make a memoir for somebody. There's no event you'd point to as a wound per se. And yet when you stop, when the to-do list is briefly done, when a quiet evening unfolds, when no one needs anything from you, something is there. A vague sense of being slightly outside your own life. A feeling that you are missing something. But the missing has no name. You might compensate by being busy. You might compensate by being needed. You might compensate by performing competence, by being the dependable one, by maintaining a slightly above average mood at all times. So the compensations also work for a while, until they don't, which is usually some combination of midlife exhaustion, a relationship that asks more depth than the compensation allows, or simply the slow accumulation of unmet need finally arriving at the front of the queue. What is often most disorienting about this is the lack of a story. There is no scene to point to. There's no flashback. There's no moment of harm. Which is why people who have this often spend years dismissing themselves. I had it fine. Other people had it worse. What right do I have to feel like this? So you have every right. The story is missing because the missing was the story. The thing that wasn't there can't be remembered because you can't remember what didn't happen. But the body remembers Not the absence itself, but its consequences. And the consequences are real. So let me be specific. Because the word nothing is doing a lot of work, and I want to break it open now. So when people say nothing happened, they usually mean a particular kind of nothing. Not nothing in general, a specific shape of nothing. So let me describe some of its common forms. There is the nothing of nobody asked how you felt. The house ran on logistics. Dinner happened, homework happened, birthdays happened. Nobody was cruel. Nobody was hitting anyone. But nobody also was ever curious about what was actually going on inside of you. The interior of your experience was not territory the family explored. It was treated as personal. The way the weather inside someone else's head is none of your business. So you learn to keep it personal too, even from yourself. There is the nothing of don't make a fuss. You were allowed to feel things mildly, within reason, as long as you didn't disturb anyone, as long as you got over it quickly, as long as you didn't bring it to the dinner table or interrupt anyone's evening with it. So you learn to feel things in private, to manage your states quietly, and to bring only the manageable version of yourself into the room. Then there is a nothing of competent from too young. Your family didn't dote on you. They expected you to be capable, and you were because you had to be. You learned to read the room, to anticipate what was needed, to provide whatever stability was possible. You were a good kid. Nobody had to worry about you, which meant nobody worried about you, which is a very particular and lonely kind of nothing. Then there is the nothing of the depressed parent, or the anxious parent, or the just checked out parent. Someone was technically present, in the chair, in the house, in the photograph, but not available. The lights were on, but there wasn't quite anyone home. So, as a child, you didn't have the language for that. You just knew that you couldn't really lean on them, so you stopped trying, and the stopping became invisible even to you. There is the nothing of a different language. Your parents loved you practically. They worked hard, they sacrificed, and they wanted the best for you. But what they couldn't give you was the particular language you needed: attunement, curiosity, being seen for who you actually were. They expressed love in dialect. You needed it in a slightly different dialect. So the love arrived, but slightly off frequency. And after a while, you stopped quite reaching for it because it kept coming back in a form you couldn't quite metabolize. And then there's the nothing of everything was fine from the outside. The family looked good. The friends thought it looked good. You yourself thought it looked good. And inside it, you were very, very quietly alone. And not because anyone was actively withholding, because the people around you didn't have the capacity to be present in their particular way that you might have needed. There was no name for it. There was just the slow accumulation of being slightly unmet 10,000 times across a childhood. So let me say something about why this is particularly so hard to claim. If you grew up with active harm, abuse, addiction, dramatic dysfunction, you have a story. The story might be terrible to live with, but it gives you something to point at, something to grieve, and something to be angry about. Something that other people can recognize as a reason. And if you grew up with this other kind of childhood, not quite met one, you have nothing to point at. And nothing has a particular cultural problem in our world. We respect the visible wound, but we don't quite know what to do with the invisible one. Which often means most people in this territory walk around comparing themselves down. Other people had it worse. Refugees, people with abusive parents, people with real trauma. Who am I to feel like this? My biggest problem is that nobody really asked me how I felt about anything, and that's not an issue. And the comparing down protects you in a way. It keeps you from claiming something that might seem self indulgent, but it also keeps you from healing. Because you cannot heal a wound if you refuse to name it. And the comparing down in itself is a continuation of the original pattern. The minimizing that you did growing up, applied now to your adult interior. You learned in childhood that what was inside you didn't quite warrant attention, and you're applying the same logic now. If I could say one thing to land here, it's this: your suffering doesn't need to compete in a tournament to qualify for attention. Pain that doesn't have a dramatic origin story is still pain. And pain that is denied because it doesn't seem big enough is often the kind that sits the longest, because it never gets the metabolism that bigger, more named pain eventually gets. So, when the responsive presence isn't quite there, the body doesn't just sit there and feel sad. It starts to adapt. And the adaptations are often the things you might think of today as your personality. Which is why this work is sometimes very destabilizing. Because you start to see that some of who you are was shaped by what wasn't there. And you can't quite tell where the adaptation ends and where you begin. So let me describe some of the common adaptations. You may have become very self-sufficient. Not because you wanted to be originally, because depending on others didn't quite work. So you concluded, sensibly, that doing things yourself was more reliable. Self-sufficiency in adults is often celebrated. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it can feel like the loneliness of always being the one who handles it. You may have become very perceptive, great at reading the room. You're aware of other people's moods even before they are. And this is a classic survival skill. And when you grow up needing to track an emotional weather that you couldn't influence, as an adult, it makes you a very good friend, a very good boyfriend or girlfriend, a good colleague, a good listener. But it is really exhausting because you can't turn it off. You may have become slightly muted in your own feelings also. Not depressed, just turned down. Because feelings in your childhood didn't quite go anywhere. They arrived, and there was nowhere for them to land. So you learn to feel them quietly, briefly, and let them pass. So now, as an adult, you have a slightly thinner feeling life than you suspect others have. Joy comes, but mutedly. Grief comes, but in narrow doses. Love arrives, you receive it, but with a slight inability to take it in all the way. You may have become uncomfortable with being looked at also. Looked after. People offer you care, and something in you politely deflects it. Not because you don't want care, because receiving it requires the equipment that you didn't quite develop. The receiving muscle, like any other muscle, has to be exercised. yours got less practice than it needed. And you may have a low level conviction that your needs are excessive. That if you actually express them fully, people around you would find them too much. Which means you might tend to ask for less than what you want and settle for less than what you need. And then resent the people who didn't notice the gap. A resentment that you usually keep to yourself because expressing it is also too much. So, if any of this sounds familiar, you're not unusual at all, and you're not damaged. You are just a person who built reasonable adaptations to what was and what wasn't available. And those adaptations were very intelligent in your childhood. They are also, as an adult, the wall between you and the kind of contact you most need. Now, I want to bring one more layer here. It's the layer that, in my work, often makes the picture make sense in a very different way. So, your parents, the ones who couldn't quite be present, who couldn't quite ask, and who couldn't quite meet you, they also came from somewhere. They were also small ones. And they almost certainly had parents who couldn't meet them also. The capacity to be present with a child's emotional life is not innate, it is transmitted. The parent who was attuned to themselves can attune to their child. The parent who wasn't often cannot. Not because they don't love their child, but because the equipment was never installed. In family constellations, we sometimes look at the line, not to assign blame, to see the shape of what was passed forward. And often what emerges is a chain of people who didn't get what they needed and therefore could not give it. The grandparents who lived through wars, migrations, loss, the great grandparents who survived poverty, the line of parents was simply too overwhelmed by survival to be curious about their child's interior. So seeing this absolutely doesn't excuse anything. The pain you felt was real, but it changes the shape. You stop facing two specific failed parents and you start seeing a longer story, a story in which everyone was carrying more than they could metabolize. And then your healing becomes not just personal, it becomes in a strange way an intervention in a longer pattern. Now, let me describe what often happens when people first start to name this. It's often very disorienting because you're claiming something you've been actively dismissing for decades. So, there can be a wave of grief that surprises you with its size. There can be anger, confused anger. And then, with time, there's often a strange relief because you're finally the language for something you've been carrying alone. So, naming itself is kind of a medicine. The wound becomes locatable. And you can stop asking what's wrong with you, that you should feel like this, and start asking what's been missing that you understandably feel like this. Then maybe there's some kind of guilt towards your parents who tried, who did what they could, towards the version of you that has been quietly minimizing for years. All of this is normal. None of this means you're doing it wrong. You're metabolizing something that was frozen, and that can take the form of guilt, grief, confusion, relief. Whatever is showing up for you is just fine. Now, to bring it all together, I want to offer you something brief and embodied. Since we've been in that territory that can feel quite cognitive, so if you can, settle a little now wherever you are. And now I want you to think of one specific thing you didn't get in childhood that other people seem to get. Not the worst thing, one specific thing. Maybe it was someone who asked when you came home from school what your day had actually been like and waited for the real answer. Maybe it was someone noticing when you went quiet. Maybe it was being read to in bed. Or maybe it was having your interests taken seriously rather than tolerated or dismissed. One specific thing you didn't get in childhood. Whatever it is, find it. As that thing is unfolding, coming up, notice what happens in your body when you name it. Not as an exercise, just notice. Where does the missing register? Where does the missing register? And now, whatever is present for you, see if you can offer it a sentence. Something like this: yes, that was missing. Yes, I'm not making it up. Yes, it mattered. Yes, that was missing. Yes, I'm not making it up. Yes, it mattered. You don't have to do anything with it now. You don't have to forgive anyone. You don't have to figure anything out or fix anything. The witnessing is the work. The acknowledgement internally that the specific thing was missing and the specific thing mattered alone starts to change something. Now, sometimes people report as this material starts to settle in that the feeling of life expands, not because anything dramatic happened, because the lifelong dampening slowly starts to relax. Now, I'm going to say something very briefly. I am in this lane both as a practitioner as an inhabitant. I grew up in a family that loved me, that worked hard for me, that wanted the best. I also grew up not quite being asked, not quite being met in the language I needed, and not quite having my interior treated as the territory worth exploring. For a long time, I had no language for this, and I'd say I had a fine childhood, and I'd dismiss anyone who suggested otherwise. The first time someone gave me language for this kind of nothing, I was embarrassingly angry because it threatened the story I'd been holding together for decades. It also slowly became a relief I didn't know I'd been waiting for. And I tell you that not to center myself, to tell you that the resistance to claiming this is normal and the dismissing is normal, and the eventual willingness to explore is the door. Now, before we close, a few things this work doesn't ask of you. It doesn't ask you to upgrade your story. You don't have to claim trauma you didn't have. The thing that was actually missing is sufficient. It also doesn't ask you to cast your parents as villains. Most of the people in this territory had parents who were really trying, who loved them, who were doing what they could with what they had. Acknowledging the wound doesn't require demonizing the source. It also doesn't ask you to do anything externally. Some people after this work have new conversations with families, and some don't. This is just inner work for your peace. What you do with it relationally is completely separate. And it doesn't ask you to fix yourself. The pattern you took an entire childhood to lay down is not going to unwind in a weekend. It will gradually unwind in the conditions that allow it to. So, if this talk has given you language for something you've been carrying without language, that might be the work landing for you. Naming is the first move. You can sit with it, and you don't have to do anything else yet. Now, just stay where you are. Notice your body, notice your breath, and notice that you've spent the last few minutes with material that you might have possibly been avoiding for decades. And that's not nothing. That's the beginning of being known by yourself. So thank you very much for listening. Take gentle care and namaste.